So storytelling is one of the oldest forms of communication, but with the proper application, it can become one of the newest forms of business communication. Everybody knows about storytelling in business as a motivational technique. In fact, if you look at most of the books on storytelling in business, Stephen Denning's books, for example, you find lots of information on how to find stories that inspire your workers, create a sense of community among your employees and colleagues. But my chapter is on something slightly different in the concept of storytelling. It gets into the concept of 2.0. Now, everybody knows 2.0 more in terms of technology and how 2.0 can be applied through technology, but at its most simple and basic level, 2.0 is about creating a dialogue rather than a monologue. Now, social networking is the perfect way to create a dialogue because it opens up a space for your customers to talk back to you. But another way is with storytelling. Say you meet somebody at a party and you tell them a story. Well, they tell you a story that's similar to that, and then you tell them a story, and you get to know each other through your longer stories or your brief anecdotes. The fact that you have shared common experiences bond you together. Companies can use this to create a relationship with their customers, starting with their origin story. I go into the concept of origin stories and how it's a little hard to find the right one because companies aren't created from one single story. People would like to think that that's the truth because it would be simple, but no one who's ever invented a company created it just from nothing. It's a whole maelstrom of ideas that come together. A good small case study in my chapter goes into the eBay origin story and how they got into big trouble when that book was published on them, saying that the story of the Pez dispensers, if you don't know the story, you can either Google it or look in my chapter, was a false story. It's not a false story. It's just not the only story. So the expose, the muckraking of this book identified another of the origin stories, calling the other one false. The Pez dispenser story is just a sexier story, so that's why they went with it. And most companies, unless they become big legendary brands and big famous brands, aren't going to deal with muckraking journalists trying to get down to the bottom of their stories. So it's about finding the sexiest story, finding the one that people will be drawn to. And then from there, starting it as a conversation, because the origin story is a monologue. To create 2.0, to create dialogue, you need to hear back. So my chapter goes into different prompts that you can use, different ways to reach your consumers, to gather stories. And I go through actually the thing that I do, which is the secrets of how I go in and gather stories and lead people through a meditation to find the right story. So if you want to hear my secrets, I've written them down in my chapter. I guess starting at the most basic level, learning to find the good story within your stories is the best training to become a PR professional, because if you can't tell your own story, you can't tell the best version of your own story. You're not going to be able to do it for your employers in the future. So if you are on a job interview or a first date, the stories you would tell are slightly different. And there are certain stories that you would never tell on a first date, or if you do, you probably won't be getting a second date. So looking into the concepts of how to find the right stories, how to figure out the appropriate story and the story that draws people in will make you more attractive and better at your job in the future. Coca-Cola. If anybody's been to the World of Coca-Cola, the one in Las Vegas, they do some really cool stuff using digital storytelling, which lifts the traditional storytelling out of what it is and takes people's stories and pairs them up with images to make sort of a digital 3-minute product. And you can go into the storytelling theater and actually watch these stories and actually go back and share your own stories on the computer later from home or in the center. And and create that conversation. If you go to their website too, you can find some of the digital stories, which are really cool. It's not so much looking for cases of people who do it badly. It's the bad idea is to not do it. The bad idea is to either monologue in story only or to not think that story is important. People have so many choices in products. Chances are your company is not the only company that does what you do. If it is, bless you. But if it's not, how do you stand out? Your story makes you stand out. Your story makes you like that person at the party that the consumer is now talking to and getting to know. You want them to describe themselves using your brand as one of the words that is them. And if they connect to your story, and if they have stories of their own, that's that connection. One of the biggest mistakes that people can make when gathering customer stories and deciding which ones to use in marketing capacities is to choose the testimonial story, the story with no crisis. Now, a crisis defined in looser storytelling terms is not always a bad thing. It's a moment of change. And if your story has, for example, someone going on a mode of transportation and deciding that they have a great trip and the food is perfect and they meet great people along the way and they love the scenery and they get there fine, that seems like a good story to sell your transportation company. But it isn't, because it's boring. And it also reeks of purchased stories. I don't believe a story that doesn't have a crisis to it. I don't believe a story that begins happily, goes happily, and ends happily. I also fall asleep from stories like that. The common mistake is to find a perfect story where everything goes perfectly, as opposed to a perfect story that has an interesting crisis. That I had the worst time flying in an airplane. Or I am afraid to fly in an airplane, so I decided to take a train. And I was nervous that I would have a bad experience, but it turned out it was great, is much more interesting than the long narrative of seeming perfection. Storytelling is the oldest form of communication, so a lot of people are going to discredit it, thinking that it's over. But with new technology, using digital storytelling, new technology of uses of social media and the internet, and technology as old as a product, on display or on packaging stories. Stories can be a way to grab the 2.0 craze in a completely different way than your competitors are.